When you think about it, they are just pieces of paper that are bound together to create the most powerful notebook in the world. For me and for every other Australian, we didn't do anything to deserve this powerful notebook. We didn't do anything that makes our lives more valuable and more powerful and more privileged than other lives who don't have a passport like this one. It is really just a roll of the dice that we have found ourselves born in Australia or have migrated here and have gained this notebook that gives our lives the ability to move between borders and to go wherever we want and to have lives that are more valuable than people in the world who will never be able to have a passport like this one. My first few memories of Iraq are actually so positive, and I love thinking back about my childhood there. And I often think about how we never intended to leave Iraq, and there was never, it was never on the table that we were going to come to Australia or live anywhere outside Iraq, because we had a reasonably good life. I remember when I was 10 years old, I would so much look forward to going to my grandma's house on the weekend, because all of my cousins, and I had a pretty big family, but all of my cousins would get together at her house over the weekend. And I just remember walking into her house and just the aroma and the smell of the food just hits you right in the face. Me and my cousins would run up to my grandma, and she'd always have a big smile on her face, and we would beg for her to make a sweet dish that she used to make for us, which is like a pancake, and she would spray icing sugar on top, and we would just love eating it, and we would beg her to make it for us. I also remember going to school. I loved school because I was a bit of a nerd, and I loved doing homework, and I loved doing maths, and I loved writing. And I had a lot of friendships in school. But every day that I got home from school, I would throw my bag on the floor and take out my books and do my homework really quickly, because I just wanted to go outside and play soccer with the kids on the street. And we would have matches where we'd play girls against boys, or sometimes we would have different family matches where if my cousins were over, we would play with the neighbours and their cousins, and we would verse each other as to who's going to win. And these are the memories that I have of my country and of my family, of my extended family in Iraq. And unfortunately, I can't relive those memories. I can't go to my grandma's house. I can't see my cousins. I can't play soccer again on the street, because that was all destroyed. I remember my family preparing for the invasion. My mum bought loads of non-perishable food that she stored around the house, and I remember our kitchen full of bags of rice and bags of flour and canned beans and bags of lentils that we had in our house. We also had a well built in our front yard, just in case water was going to be cut off, which it later was. I remember my mum putting sticky tape all over the windows in a crisscross motion, so that when the glass shatters as a result of the impact of the bombs, it doesn't cause injury for people inside the house. And the first few nights of bombs that we lived through were horrifying, because we were children. We were 3 girls and our mum in the house, and the amount of fighting and the amount of bombs that we were surrounded by made me feel like it was so much bigger than me, and there was no way that this little girl can go anywhere. There's no way that this little girl can escape or find safety, because the bombs were going on around me for miles and miles, that I can't escape them. And I remember the first night of bombs, my mum put a big mattress for us to sleep together in our lounge room. And on one side of the lounge room we had windows, and on the other side we had there was a wall. So she laid the mattress on the side where there was a wall so that we were away from the windows. And before we fell asleep, she said to us, how we can prepare for the bombs. So she told us that if she wasn't at home or if she wasn't around, that we should run to hide under the dining table or gather all of us girls and go and hide under the stairs. So that night she got us together, and it was the first night that we were going to fall asleep during the bombs. And me and my sisters were so worried, and we were crying as well because it was so loud. Everything in the house was shaking, and we were so scared. And I remember my mum getting us together, and she said a prayer. She said a prayer so that we would feel comfortable and that we would feel safe, and to really help us fall asleep. And I remember when she did that, I felt so much safer. And I don't even remember how, but I fell asleep that night. And in the morning she said, "Oh, you slept through the bombs. Well, well done," as if you went to sleep. Great. And I just remember how scared I was, and how even as a 10-year-old, and even though I didn't understand why what was happening, and even though I didn't understand how big it is and how long it's going to go on for, I knew that my life in Iraq was essentially over, because no one can live through that. No one can go on and on for days with all those bombs being dropped around them. And I remember going outside a few days later when the bombs stopped, and I just remember seeing the amount of damage that had happened in my city. I remember seeing a school that was nearby that was completely, turned into rubble. I remember houses that were bombed in our district. And even as a child, as a 10-year-old, I saw the amount of destruction, and I saw that my country was just not the same anymore. And my town and my country was no longer my home, because a home is supposed to be safe. A home is supposed to provide a sense of belonging. And my home at that moment was providing danger and potentially death. So my family and me arrived in Australia in 2003 in December, and we were introduced to Australia during Christmas and later New Year's. We were settled in Dandenong, which is a suburb in southeast Melbourne that is one of the most diverse suburbs in Victoria. I remember my class had kids from all over the world who found a home in Australia. I remember there were kids from Albania, Serbia, the Congo, Iran, Afghanistan, and me and my sisters. My community, upon arrival to Australia, gave me a welcome and an embrace like no other, and it really made up for the loss of family and friends back in Iraq. I was embraced and encouraged to be proud of who I am and my culture back home, but also the community that I was going into. I remember my teachers who welcomed me and supported me in learning English and in making friends. But within the 16 years that I have lived in Australia now, I've seen that welcome that I felt on my arrival drastically diminish. And now we see opportunistic politics and media use people seeking asylum and migrant communities as political footballs. They use us to win elections and to make money and to make headlines. And often reflecting stories that are completely inaccurate and false, or totally misconstrued. And I wanted to be the link between my refugee community and the Australian community, because I felt like I belonged to both of them, and I wanted to connect both of them, and I wanted to show Australia a real story of Australia's refugees. I remember having a ridiculous goal of meeting every Australian, because I was convinced that if people met me and if people heard my story being told by me and on my terms, that they would change their mind and that they would support refugees and that they would feel like I am just a human being just like them. Which is why I started to tell my story publicly, and why I went on a speaking tour around Australia. I did want to meet every Australian. I didn't get to do that, but I did reach hundreds of thousands of people across the country, in person and online. And I've been able to change so many hearts and minds, and I've been able to talk to people one-on-one and have them listen to and hear my story. I wanted to put a face and shine a light on the real stories of Australia's refugees. So Rasha, we met during one of the Meet Fadak stops in Brighton, and I think we had very similar stories, and I really just want to explore what the session made you think and feel.
Yeah, that session was extremely touching for me. It opened up my eyes to the stories of us, of what we actually lived through and what many other people lived through as well. And in a way, we are very, very fortunate that where we are today is a safe place. We've managed to start our lives and establish ourselves in the way we wanted to, really. More than what we wanted to, really, more than we expected. It was very emotional for me to hear actually someone talk about it, because obviously we've lived through it, we've experienced it, but to have actually someone talk about a very similar story, that's when you actually realize the size of the matter. You don't actually stop and think about, oh my God, it was really, really rough, really tough for me and so on, until you hear it from someone else. And then you start looking at it from different perspectives. Now that I'm a parent, I think about the difficulties my mother went through. My father was obviously occupied with work, so he had a distraction, but for someone who doesn't have a distraction, just to focus on their children and trying to make them feel comfortable and secure, no matter which country, no matter what circumstances we're going through, the difficulties of not being able to communicate with the rest of the society due to a language barrier, and for them to be away from their own families. Like, my mother didn't see her mother for 24 years, and that's a really long time not to see your mother. And it just put everything into perspective for me. It was incredibly emotional, but at the same time, you're always grateful for what you have, but it really makes you appreciate, that there is some humanitarian rights out there, and there are some people that welcome you and make you feel comfortable in a society. And all we want really is just a peaceful life. We just want to secure our lives for ourselves and our children, to have a normal life, which unfortunately a lot of Iraqis and many people from different parts of the world, don't have. So, when people seek refugees, the main reason is really purely just so they can secure a life for themselves and for their children. They want to make sure that their children will survive to become adults. They want to make sure that when they go to school, they'll come back safely. And that is a real concern in many countries. Like, parents drop off their children and then they don't know if they'll be able to survive. What if a bomb hits a school? Or what if happens to them on the way back? Something happens to them on the way back. So it's a real concern, and it makes you feel blessed, really, that some countries are really welcoming of us and really appreciate the dangers of us. And at the end of the day, we just want to be part of the society and have a normal life like everyone else.
I want to thank you for being here today and for being on the right side of history. and for hearing my story. But I also want you to think of someone in your life who is not on the right side of history. Whether it's someone at work, or in your extended family, or your neighbour, or just anyone you know, who, if you told them that you were here today, they would look at you funny, or think that that was a bit weird. I want you to think about that person and about how you can bring them along to care about this issue and to care about people seeking asylum. I want them to hear my story, because then they will see me for who I am. Then they will see my humanity.